rolling with the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. I'll introduce members around the table. Deputy Chair Joe Hargrave, Mr. Hugh Nerling, Mr. Daryl Harrison, Mr. Todd Gowdy, on time today, Mr. Delbert Kirsch, Mr. Jim Lemeg, Ms. Alina Young, and I'll introduce the officials from the Provincial Comptroller's Office. We have Jen Clark, Director of Finance, and we have Jane Borland, Acting Assistant Provincial Comptroller. Thank you so much for both being here. I understand that we might see Mr. Beta with a tie on in a little bit later here this morning. I'd like to welcome and introduce our Provincial Auditor, Tara Clement, and her officials. Thank them for their attendance here today and at this table. I'll table the following documents: PAC 7329, Public Service Commission, response to questions asked at the September 6, 2022 meeting. PAC 7429, Ministry of Education, Report of Public Losses, June 1st, 2022 to August 31st, 2022. Turning our attention to our first set of considerations here today, we're going to spend a good part of our morning focused on the Water Security Agency. It's a pleasure to have President and CEO Mr. Jakes of the Water Security Agency, along with all of his officials here today. Thank you to all of you for the work you do, and all those others connected to this important work. Mr. Jakes, I'll flip it over to you just to introduce the officials that are with you here today. We won't ask for any comment on the report just now, do the introduction, then I'll kick it over to the auditor to make presentation on the first 3 chapters, and then it will come back to you for subsequent comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to be here today. I'll just introduce my officials. To my right is Mark Cleefield, Vice President of Finance. Behind me is John Fallman, Vice President of Infrastructure. David Cooper, the Vice President of Agriculture Services and Economic Development. Corey White, Executive Director of Science and Knowledge Branch. Jeff Pattison to my left, the Executive Director of Standards and Approvals. Lindsay Freistad is the Executive Director of Compliance Promotion, Science and Licensing. And last but not least is Leah Clark, Executive Director of Agriculture Water Management.
Thank you so much. Welcome to everybody. Just a reminder from our clerk here as well that if you're coming forward as an official, introduce yourself and don't touch your microphone at all here. It's folks will back here keep track of us there. I'll flip it over now to our Provincial Auditor, Tara Clement, to focus her presentation. I believe they're focused on chapters 18, 16, and 13, the first 3 on our agenda. They're going to focus their presentation on the 3 together.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, Deputy Chair, committee members, and officials. With me today is Mr. Jason Shaw. He's the Deputy Provincial Auditor that's going to do the presentation with regards to the Water Security Agency. I also have Kim Lowe, who is our liaison with this committee, and she will be with us all day today, so I won't reintroduce her for every presentation. Mr. Shaw is going to basically walk through the chapters noted on the agenda in the order that they are outlined. And as the chair indicated, we are going to present the first 3 chapters together. There is 7 new recommendations for the committee's consideration, and they will be in the second presentation. And I would like to thank the President and CEO of the Water Security Agency and his staff for the cooperation that was extended to us during the course of our work. With that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
Thank you. This presentation provides our audit results of 3 years of annual integrated audits of the Water Security Agency. These chapters are included within our 2019 report, Volume 2, Chapter 18, 2020 report, Volume 2, Chapter 16, and 2021 report, Volume 2, Chapter 13. In each of the years ended March 31st, 2019, March 31st, 2020, and March 31st, 2021, we report the Water Security Agency had reliable financial statements and complied with relevant authorities. The Water Security Agency had effective rules and procedures to safeguard public resources for each of the 3 years, other than it needed an implemented and tested business continuity plan. More specifically, it needed an implemented and tested IT disaster recovery plan. The agency uses IT systems to monitor water quality and inspection data, provide real-time information on water levels throughout the province, manage financial information, and track key information about its capital assets. Without a complete and tested plan, the agency risks the lack of availability of its IT systems and data in the event of a disaster. We recognize this recommendation has now been implemented by March 31st, 2022. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks as well for the status updates that have been provided, the work that's been undertaken on this front, and it's good to see things are implemented. We don't have new recommendations here today, but on these 3 chapters, I'll now open up questions for committee members. Ms. Young?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And no presentation from officials. I can just jump right in.
Sorry, I kind of short-circuited things here. Now you put. We're not asking for a whole bunch of extra words or anything here at the table, but your presentation was made through the status update. But would you care to offer any comments with respect to these 3 chapters? And thanks, Ms. Young, for recognizing I missed a step there.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. Mr. Chair, if it's okay, I do have a few remarks I'd like to make that would set the context. So, what I would say is water is arguably Saskatchewan's most important single resource. It not only sustains our community's environment, but also supports almost every single part of our provincial economy. Whether it's agriculture, mining and resource development, agri-food production, processing, or manufacturing, and there's many more. None of these vital industries can survive without a safe, secure, reliable water source. WSA plays a central role in supporting Saskatchewan's growth plan through its mandate to responsibly and sustainably manage our water resources to enhance and expand economic growth, improve quality of life, and enhance environmental well-being. The evolution of WSA's mandate is consistent with the expansion of growth in the province, in our communities, and in the economy. And many water management initiatives, such as implementing the source water protection or developing new infrastructure, take years to plan and complete. Even though we cannot foresee all the actions that may be necessary in the future, developing a new strategic plan that projects future water demands and manages water resources provides that long-term thinking and ensures consideration for future generations. In 22-23, the Water Security Agency closed out the 25-year Saskatchewan Water Security Plan and launched our new strategic plan. And this makes significant gains in meeting and surpassing the goals of the government of Saskatchewan's 25-year plan. The principles within the plan provided guidance for all the province's work around water and groundwater supplies, and these principles will continue to inform the agency's planning and day-to-day operations. By replacing the 25-year plan with our strategic plan, WSA not only continues to build on the invaluable work already undertaken, but also reaffirms the commitment of the Government of Saskatchewan to maintaining a plan that is revisited on an annual basis. The public places a very high value on water, and therefore it is the key that WSA's new strategic plan adapts in response to emerging challenges not foreseen when the 25-year plan was originally developed. With the introduction of WSA's new strategic plan, the agency is not only reviewing its strategic plan on an annual basis, but renewing it more regularly while maintaining a long-term planning outlook. As the original 25-year plan noted in its inception, no plan can foresee all the actions that may be necessary, and so WSA must be responsive to change in our long-term outlook, in our operational planning, and in our organization. And as you will note in our summary of the 26 recommendations under review, 19 are either fully implemented or in process of being implemented. 2 more have been partially implemented and implemented under the new strategic plan, with only 5 measures not yet implemented. WSA has shown itself to be an effective organization that is responding to an evolving mandate and emerging challenges and opportunities. The report before you highlight the continuous improvement we have seen since these recommendations were first made. For example, we have established timeframes to resolve unapproved drainage on agricultural land, and we now analyze water supply and demand to determine new infrastructure needs across the province on an ongoing basis. And we support working with organizations, including the Global Water Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. And we continue to make progress in other areas such as agriculture, water management, wetlands mitigation policy, risk assessments, and more. WSA's vision to be the best water management agency in North America, providing safe, reliable water that drives economic growth. And our mission is to manage our province's water resources for a better quality of life for all Saskatchewan people. I believe with the development of our new strategic plan, our progress towards implementing these recommendations, and our responsiveness to change, we are on the path. So with that, we're now ready to take any questions the committee may have.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And I think your presentation focused on all of the chapters before us here today. So moving forward, we'll be able to be a little quicker straight from that report. But thanks for the update on all of those actions. We'll focus the questions for now on the first three chapters, 18, 16, and 13. And I'll open it up. I think Ms. Young had a question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jakes. I'll take us back to, I believe it was January 20th, 2011, when the recommendation that the WSA implement and test a business continuity plan was first made. Of course, obviously, it's 2022 now, and this recommendation has carried through over the past decade. But I do note that it is now implemented. Not being overly familiar with the Water Security Agency, I went back through, your budgets over the last years, and as this was a lingering kind of recommendation to try and find, where that had been identified in annual reports and within, your statements of operations. So I was just curious if you could talk about the prioritization of IT and cybersecurity at the Water Security Agency, and maybe I'll ask a follow-up question after that.
Question. With respect to what happened in the past, like you said, this is from 2011. One of the things that my whole executive team is pretty much new, so it's hard for me to speak to what happened back in 2011. But what I would say is, we are moving forward on this. We just recently hired a new executive director of IT that is responsible for IT at the agency. And I'm going to turn over to Mark Kleefeld because IT is under his responsibility and he can provide some more context.
Yeah, Mark Kleefeld, Vice President of Finance, and thank you for the question. I would reiterate Sean's points that, we're kind of a brand new executive team here, so I don't feel comfortable speaking to the past decade. So I've been here coming on about 8 months. I will tell you this much, that we take our position with respect to IT and IT security in particular very seriously. It's going to be a top priority. Certainly first order of business with staffing this new position, which we've just completed. We're in a position now of really assessing kind of our needs versus our current state, and then we'll make better determination of what we need to do moving forward. We are engaged in a cybersecurity audit. I don't have the results to report on that yet, but the thing I would say is that we're actively engaged on the file. We'll have good answers soon, and we'll take action then. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, and congratulations on the relatively new role. That's exciting. So just by way of follow-up on that, I noted, I believe in your annual reports that in 2020, 2021, the WSA partnered with both SaskBuilds and the Ministry of Finance for, I believe it was a 3-year approach to a multi-year IT tech strategy. Would that include, would business continuity kind of fall under that broader project scope?
I would say not entirely. That's a much more kind of broader sort of aspirational program. So what would a perfect state kind of IT thing look like for us? We're in the process with that now, kind of validating what makes sense in the real world, what do we actually want to action on. So that's where we're at with that. In terms of the intersection between business continuity and IT, it's really that disaster recovery piece, which I think we've kind of accomplished, right?
Yeah, I was curious just about the inclusion of the Ministry of Finance there, and if that was perhaps around a ransomware piece or risk mitigation or... No,
actually, absolutely not. So the Ministry of Finance does provide expertise to the rest of government with respect to planning expertise, right? So we worked with the Office of Planning, Performance and Improvement to give us some help really on structuring how we think about planning.
Okay, perfect. So much more of a project management role than anything technically specific to
yeah, I think that's a fair way to characterize it.
Fabulous. And then just last question in regards to the IT disaster recovery plan. What's the plan in terms of regular review and maintenance of this?
Yeah, thanks for the question again. So our next scheduled test of it will be December 5th of this year. And so that's not quite a year, but basically a year after our first test. And so I would think moving forward roughly once a year.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. No further questions on those chapters.
Thanks for those questions. Thanks for the responses. Any other questions from committee members? Not seeing any. We don't have any new recommendations on with respect to these chapters, so I'd welcome a motion to conclude consideration of chapters 18, 16, and 13. Moved by Mr. Nerline. All agreed? That's carried. Which the status update? We've referenced the status updates around the table here a couple times. I'll table it at this time. Table document pack 7529, Water Security Agency status update dated October 19th, 2022. I'll turn it over now to the provincial auditor to focus on the 2020 report, volume 1, chapter 13. We have 7 new recommendations in this chapter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Saskatchewan has over 100,000 water bodies, such as lakes and rivers, of which about 10,000 have human demand for water use. The Water Security Agency is responsible for regulating and controlling the flow of water in lakes, rivers, reservoirs, or other water bodies in Saskatchewan. Part of this responsibility is to plan for sustainable use of water, including licensing individuals and companies to draw water from ground or surface water sources. Effective monitoring of authorized water licenses and actual water usage is key to having a sustainable supply of water available. A safe and secure water supply is essential to Saskatchewan's continued economic development and high standard of living for both current and future generations. Chapter 13 in our 2020 report, Volume 1, starting on page 175, reports that we concluded for the 12-month period ended December 31st, 2019, the Water Security Agency had effective processes to regulate water use to support a sustainable water supply other than in the areas of our 7 recommendations. The agency regulates all water users other than certain domestic water users. This audit did not include the agency's regulation of water quality. On page 180, we recommended the agency update completion date targets for relevant key actions originally set in its 25-year Saskatchewan Water Security Plan pertaining to regulating water use to ensure water sustainability. At December 2019, while the agency's 25-year Saskatchewan Water Security Plan included a key goal and many actions related to regulating water use in a sustainable way, the agency had not revisited or updated target completion dates for actions not completed within original planned timeframes. By not updating or revising the targets for relevant key actions in its plan, the agency increases the risk of not completing timely, important actions to achieve its goal of ensuring the sustainability of surface and groundwater supplies. On page 186, We recommended the agency develop written procedures for processing and approving applications for water use licenses. At December 2019, the agency had issued over 14,000 long-term water use licenses. We found the agency's practices to review and approve water use licenses were largely unwritten and somewhat incomplete. The agency did not set expectations for when staff should require water users to report actual amounts of water used. This led to the agency inconsistently including this requirement in its groundwater use licenses we tested. Providing clear guidance to staff on when to require water users to track and report actual water use is important. This information enables the agency to determine if licensees comply with licenses. In addition, we found the agency, when considering renewals of groundwater use licenses, did not set what work it expects staff to do to determine whether water use remains sustainable before renewing a license. We found it reviewed actual water use data for some renewals, but did not do so consistently. Also, for 6 of 14 renewals tested, it did not request and review updated groundwater investigation reports. Furthermore, while the agency informally expected staff to document their decisions and the basis of those decisions, it had not set in writing minimum documentation staff are to keep or where documentation should be kept. Not having clear written guidance increases the risk of the agency not treating applicants equitably. In addition, not having formal expectations for staff to follow when assessing water use license applications increases the risk of staff not obtaining and maintaining sufficient information to support the agency's decisions. On page 189, we recommended the agency clearly document its consideration of key components used to predict water availability of a proposed water source before related surface water use licenses are approved. Water availability studies are important as they are a key input in determining whether planned water use through issuing licenses is sustainable. We found for 3 of 5 studies tested, the agency did not document its analysis of all components of the water availability assessments as expected, or document why staff did not consider those components of those studies. For example, for one of the items tested, the agency did not document whether it considered water lost from the water body due to evaporation. Not documenting key judgments increases the risk of not having support for the conclusion about whether the surface water source can sustain the requested amount of water use. On page 192, we recommended the agency implement written procedures about estimating and recording licensed water use. The agency often estimates amount of water used by licensees. While estimating water use can be appropriate, using estimates for many licenses increases the risk the agency has insufficient or unreliable water use data to assess compliance with licenses. We found the agency inaccurately recorded both reported actual water use and estimated water use information in the agency's water use records. Also, during our detailed review of 27 water user licenses where the agency records records showed water usage exceeded allocation significantly, we found 7 licenses where the agency's water use data contained errors. We found these 7 water users did not exceed their allocation. Inaccurate data in its water use records reduces the ability to analyze the impact of use on a water source or individual licensee basis. On page 193, we recommended the agency monitor whether water use licensees comply with key water use license conditions. We found the agency did not actively monitor whether individual licensees complied with water use licenses, mainly whether licensees exceeded their annual water allocation allowed. Receiving actual water use annually from licensees and comparing this to water allocation is the most effective way to monitor this. In section 4.9 of the chapter, we found the agency only requested 20% of licensees to provide annual water use information. Of those, the agency only received the requested actual water use info for about 50% of those licensees. We found the agency took little action to obtain this information. Further, our analysis of the water use of licensees from 2014 to 2018 found 7 licensees who did not provide, who did provide actual water use information exceeded their allocation by more than 100 million liters of water at least once during 2014 to 2018. Also, for licensees the agency's estimated water use amount exceeded the licensee's allocation by more than 100 million liters. Not actively monitoring whether individual licensees exceed annual licensed water use allocations increases the risk of unidentified noncompliance with water use license provisions. If individual licensees consistently use significantly more water than allowed, there's increased risk of the agency making inappropriate water allocation decisions for the related water body and jeopardizing the long-term sustainability of related water bodies. On page 194, we recommended the agency develop written enforcement procedures for staff to follow when the agency identifies licensed water users not complying with water use licenses. The agency had not established processes setting how to identify noncompliance with licenses, what constitutes significant noncompliance, or actions it would take to address identified significant noncompliance. By not having effective processes to enforce water use license conditions or consequences for significant noncompliance, the agency increases the risk that license holders continue to violate license conditions. This may reduce the long-term sustainability of water bodies. On page 195, we recommended the agency periodically give senior management written reports on noncompliance with key water use license conditions and related enforcement strategies and actions. Senior management did not receive sufficient information about licensees identified as not complying with water use licenses and related enforcement activities. Not reporting this information to senior management increases the risk of the agency not taking sufficient or appropriate action to bring water use license holders into compliance for significant infractions. This concludes my presentation. I'll pause for the committee's consideration. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is a really important focus that comes out of this chapter. So thanks for the recommendations, the work on this front. Thanks to the Water Security Agency for some of their work to address these recommendations as well. Now, Mr. Jakes, I think you gave sort of some all-encompassing remarks at the front end. Do you have anything more specific at this point?
Oh, Mr.
Not
Chair.
seeing any, we'll open it up for questions. Ms. Young.
Thank you. Let's dive in. I think probably best to go through the recommendations sequentially. So I'll start with the first one, which is actually, I suppose, where we're going to finish as well. And Mr. Jakes, you noted, of course, the new strategic plan that has replaced the 25-year plan. And I believe you said that the new strategic plan is in place to protect resources and identify demands. Now, understanding there is a distinction between those two things, like they're both great priorities. You also noted in your comments that the new plan will surpass government goals, but I also note that it doesn't include, like there are a number, I believe about 10% of the recommendations from the 25-year plan, which were just fully abandoned. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that difference. And, just as a layperson reading some of them, I thought like, oh boy, like that sounds, knowing nothing about water management, that sounds fairly significant, the mapping of aquifers and identification of, emerging technologies for conservation. So could you perhaps speak to those priorities which have been abandoned and whether or not and where they're found in the new strategic plan? And if not, what that change in strategic direction signifies?
Good second.
obnoxiously interesting, and it's, you know, some of the functions of this chapter itself. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for the question, Ms. Young. You know, maybe just a couple comments on, you know, why we transitioned away from the 25-year plan. And I made some opening remarks around that. You know, 25 years is a long time, and it's a long time both from, from the environment side as well as the economy. It's hard to plan and foresee what's going to happen in the 25 years. So that is why the agency, we transitioned to a 4-year strategic plan, something that we can renew and review annually and in 4-year increments. Your question was about some of the actions that were no longer being pursued. And out of the original 25-year plan, there was 90 recommendations, which is a lot to follow up on, you know, every year. So out of the 90, only 4 are no longer, you know, directly identified in our new strategic plan. So, for example, promote the adoption of best conservation and efficiency practices and technology through education, regulations, water license conditions, and new programming. So some of that is kind of embedded in our day-to-day work that we do ongoing in the agency. Another one is developing detailed aquifer maps. Well, you know, in our hydrology unit, we are still doing that of the major aquifers. That is work that kind of goes ongoing. And the other one was by watershed, determine the existing use of water. So that's, you know, kind of our regular course of business when we're reviewing, you know, licensing or water usage or whatever it may be. That's part of our regular business.
So then you feel these actions are being thoroughly undertaken by the agency, but just much more part of your day-to-day business as usual and unnecessary to like prioritize as a target in strategic planning.
That's exactly it. That's precisely it.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, may I just add one more? So I just, in the interest of full transparency, we had, Sean mentioned 4 areas and just missed one. So the other is publish a state of the watershed report every 5 years. So I actually don't know for sure that we'll publish that precise report. The work stays the same again, right? This becomes just operational work that we do on a regular basis. And for that reason, it's not part of a strategic plan. It's in branch plans, basically.
But that, and forgive me, thanks for that, because I had 5 written down too, so I thought that was my error. There will, the State of the Watershed report, that was a public-facing available document.
Yes.
Yes, and there will be, I'm hearing some replacement reporting that is publicly available. Yep.
Yeah, so I'll just make a quick point, and then the people who know details will speak to those. The one point I did want to make sure that we have out on the record here is that we produce a huge number of reports, right? Some of that's a push to the public, a lot of it's not. But in saying that, I do want to be clear and on the record that all of our reports are publicly available, right? So typically people who do have an interest are aware. And at any point when we get a public request, we do provide the reports. And then I think Jeff will speak to what replaces that watershed report.
Jeff Patterson, Executive Director of Standards and Approvals. The State of the Watershed report was taken over by State of the Environment report that Ministry of Environment does. And part of that report includes the water information and the watershed information. So it's now in the State of the Environment report.
A question about that one later on in one of these chapters. So thanks, Mr. Patterson. Moving on to the next recommendation around written procedures required for assessing water use license applications. I guess just noting that this is partially implemented and that there has been work undertaken to meet the intent of this recommendation. Can you help me understand, because it seems, and I have a great admiration for the knowledge and expertise within your organization, but it just seems on the surface that relying on the knowledge and experience of staff, lacking some of those written procedures and regular review is potentially subjective and puts the agency at risk, both in terms of, you've noted you're a new management team, so potential for staff turnover as well as a lack of public confidence in the decision-making process. And I do note that, decision records have been developed, a new standards unit has been undertaken to create support for the development of these written procedures. Can you provide a bit more of a precise update on that, as well as clarification of ultimately who the accountable parties and decision makers are in those steps?
In the licensing steps?
Sure. I think it speaks to a number of different processes for applications in the chapter. But I guess what I'm asking is ultimately, do you feel comfortable with the checks and balances that will be in place with these new written procedures to ensure that they, as senior management, that they actually are being used and followed? It will be, it sounds like a culture shift for the organization, which is, culture is challenging to impact. So ensuring that this work does not simply exist in a vacuum, I guess. Can you speak to the accountability piece of ensuring it's actually, actually happening? You don't just have beautiful procedures sitting unused.
question. I'm going to just make a few comments, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, who is, the expert, knows all the detail. But, first of all, I would just like to say, I'm a relatively new CEO to the organization, not quite 2 years, but I would like to thank the auditor for raising this point. It's something that, our management team does agree with, and we are working towards resolving. What I would say ultimately, myself as the CEO is ultimately responsible for all of this. And in June of this year, I did a bit of a reorg in the organization to try to consolidate some of these functions. And so now I do have a direct kind of line of sight on this. This is part of the Science and Knowledge Division, which Jeff is Executive Director, and he's ultimately responsible for the day-to-day work on that. But, as CEO now with, consolidating everything licensing, water allocation into one division has allowed us to, I can be more aware of what's going on. But I'm going to turn this over to Jeff to speak to the details.
Yep, thanks, Sean. So this is partially implemented. We did develop a decision matrix that the auditor pointed out. When we make decisions, we weren't recording those decisions. So we developed a decision matrix that goes along with every water license we issue, and it goes on file so that those decisions made for that license is on record. We still need to hammer out our written procedures. It's just one staff right now that does the water usage licenses. So we will, they've done some pre-work on those processes, and our new standards unit that was just created in June will now develop those procedures and guidelines for that staff so that if that staff leaves or something happens, or we can show how that process works.
Thank you very much. And is it a safe assumption to assume that when those decisions are being made, it's a consistent criteria that is being applied?
That's part of that decision record, to provide that consistency from file to file.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Yeah, and just maybe not to put too fine a point on it, but it was noted by this chapter by the provincial auditor that not having that clear written guidance can increase the risk to the agency of potentially not treating applicants equitably. So is there, I guess, are there any ongoing concerns that you'd want to identify for the committee, or even potentially from the auditor, that this has been occurring, or that it will not be occurring in the future?
Thanks for the question. I think my answer would be this, and we do not come to this, I think, with evidence of a lot of inconsistent decision-making. We think the auditor makes a totally fair point from a process management perspective. It's a point that we take and a point that we're going to action on. So based on that, my view is that our risk profile on this will get less and less risky as we go, and we're already improving, and we're just going to get better, I think. So we're coming from a point without evidence of actual inconsistent judgment in practice, just a kind of a process problem, and we're working to improve it. So I don't have evidence to suggest that there's a problem out there in the real world on this.
I will just make a comment on this from our perspective. So in terms of when we did the audit work, no concerns necessarily with, like you said, the approvals that are being made and the water use licenses that are being issued, but there was variation in the water use licenses and the terms of those particular licenses. As the agency has indicated, having a decision record that clearly supports, why would that be? Why do certain water use applicants have certain reporting requirements and others don't? Maybe that makes sense, but there wasn't anything to support that. So there we did find that variation, and probably having these procedures to support and the decision record that now exists will be something we will see, because we do have intent to follow this up in terms of we will be doing the work in 2023 and then obviously publicly report out to confirm in terms of what the agency is stating around implementation or partially implemented.
Okay. Great, thank you. And I think that speaks to the potential concern, just ensuring that there is clear documentation in terms of why there may be differing criteria used to allocate applications for water use. So I just have one point of interest in section 4.5, and then I'm going to jump to recommendations 4 and 5. I noted on page 186, it speaks about how the agency and Environment and Climate Change Canada have, I believe it's 300 hydrometric monitoring stations located throughout the province. Just out of curiosity, is it the province or the feds, or is it jointly paid for, and who does the actual monitoring?
Thank you for the question. I'm John Fallman, the Vice President of Infrastructure. I'll just make sure I got the question right. There's 300 hydrometric stations, and it was who operates and who pays, more or less?
Shared responsibility?
Yeah, it's a shared responsibility. So we have a unique model in Saskatchewan, actually, where the province runs about 130 of the stations, and the federal government runs the other 170, give or take a few. We have a formal cost share agreement between Canada and ourselves as to how the costs are allocated and paid for each of the stations, actually. And also for data production, and we have a formal agreement with them as to how this data gets published, and quality control, quality assurance, all that type of stuff. So,
interesting. So certain stations will be then exclusively.
Yeah, they actually have a formal process where they call them FP stations, federal stations, provincial stations, and shared stations. So federal stations are ones that are typically, say, used to measure water that goes across the transboundary in, say, the United States, where there's formal agreements you have to share that water. So the federal government will run those as a national station. We operate lots of stations on our interprovincial waterways, but let's say maybe on the Capel River system, where we have a very operational interest in making sure the lakes are at the right levels. Those are provincial stations.
Okay, interesting. That is a unique model, and the costs are shared according to the number of stations and.
According to the distribution of those F&P units that they put on it, to be very specific. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Fallman. And is that kind of shared responsibility for the monitoring? Is that just for the hydrometric stations, or?
That's just for the hydrometric stations. We as a province have invested our own money in more meteorological stations for weather, and all the groundwater monitoring stations are all entirely provincially funded.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay.
So moving to recommendations 4 and 5. think maybe I'll just ask specifically about recommendation 5 on page 192, where the analysis speaks to, license holders exceeding their allocation. Are these 7 license holders identified there the same 7 water users who are identified in the previous section? Do you know that? Just at the top of page 192, it speaks to 7 water users who are identified as having exceeded, but they used an incorrect unit of measurement, so they actually hadn't exceeded.
I think 7 is just a coincidence.
Just a coincidence? Okay. So then perhaps question for the officials. For, more systemic non-compliance, can you speak to what the consequences are? I assume it would be in the legislation, but I didn't look myself. What are the penalties and repercussions that exist in legislation for kind of systemic non-compliance, as well as what is regularly enforced by the WSA?
Former refugees that grew up in refugee camp in the jungle, and they love hunting and fishing. But we had to have some real conversations about what you can hunt in Saskatchewan versus perhaps what you can hunt and eat in the jungles of Thailand. And it's they'll bring us stuff once in a while, which is super generous. But I'm like very skeptical about what animals it actually is. What rules are the dirty 30s, I think lots with gophers. Oh, for sure. They're horrified that you can't hunt the rabbits in Regina. They're like, it's right here on my lawn. Why do you want to? Just do not love snare or define camp. Well, I'm not going to be the one to encourage you.
Well, use a board, don't use a gun, use a bowl at least. Use the gun. You could get a little attention. So actually, when I was in Vietnam, we passed a dog in the convey. Only dog meat. I did not see it.
I'll eat almost anything once. Give it a try.
Same here.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. My name's Lindsay Freisted. I'm the Executive Director of Compliance Promotion. And so my position is reasonably new within the organization. It was intended to focus on all of the compliance promotion activities that the agency undertakes, with the exception of egg water management, which is held in a different area. And so in this particular circumstance, what we're looking at is we're wanting to do some compliance promotion using a least means necessary approach up to and including enforcement activities when necessary. And so we do engage the services of Provincial Protective Services, our conservation officers, when we do go to that investigation and prosecution when warranted. And so we meet with them regularly to discuss files that would potentially be going under transition to investigation and prosecution. I don't have the specific penalties available to me right now or the statistics as Provincial Protective Services holds that information.
And would Provincial Protective Services then be reporting back to either yourself or the senior management team on those actions or investigations as a regular part of reporting?
Yes, we have quarterly meetings that are set up and we pull them even more frequently when necessary. This is a new model that we're working towards as we're establishing some more clear lines of responsibility between Provincial Protective Services, conservation officers, and our environmental project officers.
Okay, great. And do you feel these new projects are resourced for success?
We added 2 new positions to the environmental project team recently to make sure that we're able to undertake all the activities that are necessary. And then I can't speak to Provincial Protective Services. I'm hopeful that they are as well.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I think recognizing the clock, it may be best to move on to the next chapter because we have these folks until, what, 11:15?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a guideline at that time. If there's pertinent questions, this is a substantive chapter here with 7 new recommendations. So I wouldn't, if you've got a couple extra questions that are pertinent, I'd say go ahead and place them. But I know Hugh looks hungry too. I am as well. So.
Okay.
And Mr. Nerline has. You know what I'll do is I'll pop over to Nerline for a question, and then we'll come back.
Thank you. Mr. Jakes, could you just give us a thumbnail sketch for the thousands of people that are watching online, what the aquifers in Saskatchewan sort of look like in terms of how many large, what you would define as large aquifers exist, and kind of a broad picture of sort of the state of the aquifers? Thank you.
Get somebody with more detail.
Good question.
So the question is, what's the broad state of the aquifers in Saskatchewan and how many? Oh boy. So we live in a really, really unique geological environment here. I'm going to try and address your questions very specifically. So as first off, the very big ones. The geology of the province is underneath the bedrock, or just on top of the bedrock, underneath all the glacial deposits that were mixed up by all the glaciers. There's a lot of old valleys. So you look today, like the Capel Valley, there's a bunch of those old kind of ones. Those are what I would call the big ones. We have those mapped, okay? They're mostly in the southern part of the province. Below that, like especially in the southwest, there's lots of large bedrock type aquifers. Okay, those are all mapped too. Where it gets really messy is in where the glaciers came and stirred it all up. And that's everything above the bedrock, and that's like in the southern half of the province. So what we look for there is in between the different layers of where the glaciers came, there's aquifers within there. We have most of those mapped, okay, too. So there's no real easy answers to how many. There's hundreds, I would say, and lots of pretty big ones, and lots of really small ones. And you really don't know till you drill a hole. To be blunt, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
That's fine, thanks.
Yeah.
Not seeing a follow-up there. I'll flip it over to Ms. Young.
Yeah, I think I'll just circle back for more information in terms of the risk-based compliance framework being developed. Broad strokes, but budget, is this internal, is this external? The deadlines given as part of the status update for the end of the 22-23 fiscal year, is that reasonable, and are those just for the actions outlined here, or are those for the full project to be implemented?
Can I just clarify your question on the budget being internal versus external? Sorry, what exactly are you?
I was curious about the budget for and scope of the risk-based compliance framework, whether that project is internal or whether that's something being done externally with either other government ministries or agencies or an external consultant.
I understand. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. So we're currently in the project scoping phase of the entire project, and so we're nearing completion of the evaluation of our current state and our proposed future state for all of the pieces that would be incorporated within that project. Once that is approved, then we'll be doing the full project scoping and we'll have a better understanding of what that will look like. We fully anticipate utilizing all of our internal resources to manage the project. However, we won't know for sure until we do the full project scoping, and at that point we'll determine whether or not we need to utilize external consultants to complete that work. As far as the budget that's allocated currently, we have 3 executive directors currently working on finalizing the actual proposal, as well as several members within the actual organization itself that are supporting the research and analysis and recommendations for that proposal. So it's pretty hard to estimate the exact number that we're allocating currently, but we should have better numbers on the full project later this year. We do have 2 pieces there as far as the timelines go. So the project proposal should be coming forward fairly soon for approvals. Once we get the approvals to proceed, we'll draft out the entire project plan, including the activity breakdown and budget and resource allocations for that. And that would be, we're hoping to complete that project by the end of next fiscal year.
Perfect, thank you. And then in the interim, noting the deadlines of last fiscal, next fiscal, and the recommendation itself, which speaks to, senior management receiving written reports on non-compliance with key water use license conditions. Will those reports be going to senior management in the interim prior to the end of next fiscal, and however long this multi-year project ends up taking, recognizing it's not yet scoped?
I think what I would, just say in the interim while we're working on this, absolutely, if there are non-compliance issues, they would be coming to senior management and myself directly. When I go back to, my comments on the reorg and how we've structured it, I do have that direct line of sight. So in the interim, until Lindsay's team and Science and Knowledge get this, sorted out, any non-compliance would come to senior management.
Okay, perfect, great, thank you, because it's noted as a solve for a few of the recommendations, but with a longer tail on the project. Just want to follow up on that accountability piece. Perhaps ending this chapter on a bit of a higher level question, because I do note there's a significant number of recommendations. Starting on page 195, but you've mentioned, Mr. Jakes, the Saskatchewan Plan for Growth a couple times in relation to the important work that your agency does, both in terms of supporting industry and quality of life for people in Saskatchewan. My understanding is that significant economic drivers in the province, whether it's power generation, oil and gas, mining, these are also significant, agriculture, these are significant water users in the province as well. Can you speak to the consultation process, if any, that occurs between the province's industrial growth strategy and launch of these projects? Great economic drivers and the Water Security Agency to ensure that the resources are there and, appropriately licensed.
So what I would say is that, oh, sorry. So what I would say is that, we do sit at, broader government conversations, when it comes to water usage. So we have an input, like WSA as an agency, we are not directly responsible for negotiating or working, when it comes to, whether it be an industrial user or somebody else wanting to use the water, but we do have input into that. Our agency's role is to provide input, advice, to make sure that there's enough water, whether it be groundwater or surface water, for whatever the request of the water is. Then in my reorganization, we created an economic development unit. So we have somebody that can be involved in those conversations when we're asked or when the province is asked, and to balance that need off of, what is the request of the industry that's wanting the water, to balance off, the science side, to make sure that we're protecting, the environment and making sure that we have enough water. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of our role in these.
Sure. Trent, did you have any questions?
Cognizant of the time, this is a substantive and important chapter, but Mr. Nerline has one more. Oh, you don't. I know we could probably canvass this area, longer because there's lots to it. Any further questions from this table? Certainly appreciate all the follow-up and the commitments and the timelines. And as the auditors identified for folks at home or those that care about this chapter, the auditor does follow back up and measure those pieces. We are, we'll be with water security once again to do follow-up on these chapters as well and ensure implementation. Not seeing other questions at this point, I'd welcome a motion to concur and note compliance with recommendations 1 and 3. Moved by Mr. Gowdy. All agreed. That's carried. A motion to concur and note progress for 2 and 4. Mr. Nerline. All agreed. That's carried. And a recommendation to simply concur with recommendations 5, 6, and 7. Moved by Mr. Lemeg. All agreed. That's carried. Okay, we'll turn our attention to Chapter 31, and I'll flip it over to the auditor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Agricultural drainage is any action that producers take to remove or lessen the amount of water from their land. Appropriately planning and approving drainage projects is important to mitigate the risk of drainage causing flooding, water quality, and wildlife habitat concerns. Also, it is important to manage the risk of drainage reducing wetlands. Wetlands improve water quality. There are many unapproved drainage works existing in Saskatchewan. Chapter 31 in our 2021 report, Volume 1, starting on page 285, reports the results of the progress the Water Security Agency made on recommendations initially made in our 2018 audit of whether it had effective processes to regulate the drainage of water on agricultural lands in the geographic areas assigned to the Yorkton and Weyburn regional offices. By December 2020, the agency implemented 2 recommendations, partially implemented 8 recommendations, and made limited progress on 1 recommendation. The agency implemented a process for the periodic review of its watershed vulnerability map, which is a map that identifies the areas of the province at greatest risk of flooding. It uses this map in its assessment of drainage works applications. Also, the agency set and followed its process when assessing the validity of complaints it receives from landowners referred to as requests for assistance related to unapproved drainage works. By December 2020, we found the agency still needs to do more to effectively regulate agriculture drainage. It needed to develop water quality and wetland retention policies. Without these policies, it may not adequately consider these important aspects when assessing and approving drainage works. Second, it needed to finalize and approve its request for assistance manual, which sets how staff address and respond to these concerns. Also, it could improve transparency by publishing enforcement escalation timeframes which it uses to resolve requests for assistance files for unapproved drainage works. Next, it needs to carry out enforcement activities consistent with its enforcement escalation timeframes. For over 1/2 of the 16 requests for assistance files we tested, we found the agency did not follow its escalation process. Not taking timely action on identified unapproved drainage works increases the risk that further damage may occur to surrounding landowners and the receiving water body if resolution of unidentified, unapproved drainage works does not occur timely. while the agency made progress creating tools to assist staff in considering and documenting risks to the watershed while assessing applications for drainage works, we found staff did not consistently use these tools. In 12 of the 20 application files we tested, staff did not sufficiently document its assessment as expected. Lack of consideration of these risks may result in inappropriate drainage works being approved, resulting in more water going to a water body than it can handle. The agency did not have a sufficient plan to identify and address existing unapproved drainage works in high-risk areas. Leaving these unapproved drainage works in high-risk areas increases the risk of flooding, water quality issues occurring, or loss of wetlands. Lastly, the agency can continue to improve its reporting to senior management about the activities undertaken to address non-compliance of unapproved drainage works. Also, it can continue to improve its reporting to the public about key enforcement actions taken to regulate agricultural drainage. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation and the follow-up here. Certainly something, a real important focus for the province. You've already offered comments. Mr. Jakes will open it up for questions.
Sure.
Ms. Young?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I note the only mention of wetlands, I believe, is in the planned actions for implementation for recommendation 1. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that and whether you're able to go into more detail about what that mitigation policy will include and whether you feel that sufficiently addresses the concerns as they relate to wetlands in the province.
So, thank you for the question. And you're right, it is an important topic. And, wetlands are mentioned in a number of the recommendations. So it's kind of smattered throughout. I think it's 1, 4, 9, and 11 all have components of the, wetlands. But what I would say is, WSA, we're working on a new mitigation policy, which we've committed to having rolled out by the fall of 2023, which does include a wetland component. So that's all going to be part of that policy that's rolled out. You had asked about, can we, speak to some of the detail of what that policy looks like? We've started the consultation process, stakeholder engagement this past year. We've had a couple open houses. We've got a website that's, up and running where we have what we've heard from the initial conversations. We're allowing other people to put in input. They can, submit their questions, comments to that. We will be having some further consultations on this policy, and then our group will take it back and we'll work on it over the winter months, early next year, to bring back in a formal policy, for 2023.
And Just with the terminology of mitigation policy being fairly broad, will it be this developing mitigation policy that speaks exclusively to concerns or sub-policies perhaps related to wetlands and some of the issues identified in the auditor's report?
Hi, I'm Corey White. I'm the Executive Director of our Science and Knowledge Branch. We have an overarching mitigation policy framework. So that overarching framework considers the impacts related to flooding, water quality, habitat, as well as soil health and greenhouse gas management. So really, the mitigation approach is an approach to manage for those priorities or impacts. Underneath that, we'll have a number of policy tools, one of which will focus on wetlands, the amount of wetlands we need to manage for those impacts. In addition to other things like sediment and erosion control, flow control, coordination with aquatic habitat, and a number of other tools so that we can adequately address the full scope of impacts. Currently, wetlands is a primary focus for us as we move forward into our engagement process.
Perfect, thank you. And a follow-up question on that, both in regards to the mitigation policy and this underlying policy tools that you've identified in a variety of those areas. I note that this was first recommended, I believe, in the auditor's report. These recommendations were made in, I believe, 2018. And throughout the status updates, it speaks to, some draft policies being in place as of 2020. And now we're in 2022, and the timeline for implementation is listed as 2023. So is it possible for the committee to kind of get an understanding of when that work began? You've mentioned some engagement work, and whether or not that signifies perhaps a change from those draft policies in 2020, or essentially help us understand the lag between 2018 to 2023 and whether or not that timeline will be achieved.
Yeah, so something I should have mentioned when I made those comments. You're right. There was some of those draft policies were put in place in 2020. As you know, Saskatchewan's a really large province, and we want to make sure we get this right. And water on the landscape is very different in different parts of our province. So up in the northeast, where I farm, typically too much water is the issue. And then you get to the southwest, they're trying to capture every bit of water they can. So we want to get this right. We want a made in Saskatchewan approach. And so, the policies were implemented in 2020. WSA also invested some money, I think it was about $1 million, into a number of demonstration and research projects around the province. And we started that in 2021, I believe.
2020, March
2020. And so that information will also be used in developing, the policy moving forward. So, there are things that look at nutrient management. They look at, the economics. There's I just can't remember the other one, just an example.
Threshold.
Yeah. So that's all information that will be, compiled along with the consultation process, the feedback from stakeholders in developing and updating our policy in 2023.
Can I just add that those policies that were in place and approved previously still are in place and approved. So currently we're just working on improving draft policies with more information if they weren't approved, and filling some of the gaps that we had before, one of the major gaps being the policy around wetlands.
Great, and hearing that engagement process is still ongoing. So for I think Mr. Nerleen said thousands of people watching at home who, I shouldn't joke, this is really important work, but for folks out there in the province who feel quite passionately about this, they still have opportunities to engage. Great, so recognizing the clock here, I think going through this, my biggest takeaway, my next biggest takeaway was some, I guess, question around or concern around public confidence with some of the gaps identified in perhaps a lack of escalation on non-compliance and the lack of rationale being provided. This isn't something I've firsthand experience with, but it certainly seems to be something we hear about in the province, frustrations on all sides of this issue. So I suppose my tougher question is, do you feel the existing processes and policies are adequate and sufficient to maintain public confidence in the WSA and some of the important compliance work?
So, your question is, I would say there will be. I think the single most important thing is to make sure we get this policy right and make sure that it works, for everybody. And with our reorganization, we've also, put a priority on this as well. And so we separated the compliance and the approval components of this important work. And policies are important. Currently, we have 18 internal policies that deal with this and 8 operational policies. Client focus is also, a key component for us, and making sure that we work with the landowners. And these are very complex situations, and no two kind of approvals or requests for drainage are the same. They can be, be very different, just depending how many quarter sections are included, depending, where they're located. And so, it is important that we do work with our client, and it is a focus in our new strategic plan to have client service front and center, not only on the ag water management, but all other components of what we do in the agency. What I would also say when it comes to, communicating, we get that, that's important, but it does make it a bit of a challenge to communicate publicly when it comes to compliance issues because of confidentiality. It's hard to talk about, individual persons, what's going on their operation. But I do get, where the public comes from. But we do take it seriously, and every file is different. And like I said, we had policies put in place back in 2020 that kind of set that groundwork, and we're going to continue to refine that. And by 2023, we will have, a mitigation policy, which includes a wetland component rolled out.
Thank you. I note in the escalation process that it states that as of December 2020, the agency had not approved nor finalized the request for assistance manual. Has that happened in the intervening years?
So the RFA manual is still in progress. We've made significant progress towards finalizing it, and we're on track for finalizing it this January.
Thank you. And how many enforcement actions were undertaken in the past year?
Do you have that?
Or last reporting cycle, I'm not sure what that would
Be.
Leah Clark. I'm the Term Executive Director of Agriculture Water Management. So we got some of the data here from 2021, 2022. We received 67 requests for approvals in that year. 32 of those are completed. 20 were issued recommendations and/or are involved and have progressed to the network drainage approval initiative, which is one of the outcomes of those recommendations. From there, 15 remain under investigation.
I may just add just one comment on that. When we talk about approvals or even RFAs, it doesn't mean that, they're just automatically approved. Somebody puts in a request and we say it's good to go. We work with the landowner, we work with other, impacted individuals along the way or along that watershed. And sometimes changes need to be made to the plan. And that's part of the whole process in working with, all the clients. So I just want to make that comment.
And last question for me is stakeholder confidence or satisfaction something that you measure as an agency as it would relate to some of those processes that have the potential for I don't want to say conflict, but more challenging conversations. I'm just wondering if you measure that or report internally or externally on that.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. And certainly I think as we mature as an organization, one of the things we want to do better is measure our performance quantitatively, right, against standards. We did launch this year our first client service, our client satisfaction survey, on the ag water management side of things. That was launched April 1st of this year. Our company in Citrix is still processing the results, so we'll have that hopefully very soon. Bigger picture though, right, this is going to be a priority for us. I think as Sean mentioned, one of our 4 key strategic priorities is client service. And so we need to measure against that, right? And so we've created a client services director position. This person is currently defining our service standards and expectations in client service, and then we will measure quantitatively against those moving forward in the future.
Just a very specific question. A quick one is, am I correct to understand there was a moratorium on drainage projects or permits in that area that flows into the Quill Lakes for a period of time? And is that moratorium still in place?
So in answer to that, no, there was no formal moratorium on drainage in the Quill Lakes watershed. However, this watershed has been classified as an extreme vulnerability watershed due to its lack of natural outlet and current flooding conditions. We alluded to the wetland vulnerability map that we use as kind of a risk assessment when initiating those compliance activities, and so that extreme vulnerability, of course, elevates it.
There seemed to be an understanding with some folks in the area that there'd been a moratorium in place on this front, and I know that was then a concern when you sort of tour the area, just heavy equipment all over the place, earth-moving equipment, advancing projects. I know this is an area that you're focused on. Would it be your feeling that the majority of that earth-moving equipment, or all of it, I mean, it's easy to see, it's lots of stuff going on, are those permitted projects then?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, for the question. I guess what I would say is that, we can't speak definitively to the question, but I think what we'd say is there is a process that is followed if there's any concerns. And so given the context and the situation there, we would follow up on those obviously very seriously. We do take a kind of a risk-based approach in that area's vulnerability is not lost on us. So we would follow those very carefully.
Just to be maybe more specific, then, so there's projects that have been permitted this last year in that area, because there's certainly a number of projects that have been active and being advanced.
Thanks again for the question, Mr. Chair. Right now, in terms of kind of work that we're doing in the Quill Lakes area, we've actually got 9 active RFAs that are underway. So no approved projects in the last short period, but we are in fact focusing more on the compliance side. So we are aware of some concerns there that our staff are actively working on.
No, it's good that you're out there. I know there's these are heated discussions with lots of concern on the ground, and it's obviously important that if you have a set of you have laws or regulations, that they're followed, and misunderstandings on this front aren't helpful either. So I know there's a lot of, last time I was out there anyways, there's a lot of equipment moving earth out there on these fronts. Not seeing any other questions at this point on this chapter, and knowing that we'll do follow-up on this work, thanks to the Water Security Agency for all their work on this chapter and all others. Very important work in the province. I would welcome a motion to conclude consideration of Chapter 31, moved by Mr. Harrison. All agreed? That's carried. Thank you so very much, Mr. Jakes. Do you have a final quick word for us? To you, we want to say thank you for your presence here today, your leadership and your work. Any final work before we kick you out of here?
I just want to thank the committee for your questions this morning. Thank the provincial auditor, and thank my team to be with me today to answer a lot of these questions. So thank you, guys.
Thanks very much to all of you. We'll take a very brief 1-minute recess, and up next we've got Ministry of Parks, Culture, and Sport. All right, we'll reconvene the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, move along here this morning and turn our attention to the Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport. Thank you so very much to the officials that have joined us here today and all those officials and others that have been involved in the work that we'll consider here today. I'd like to introduce Ms. Johnson, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Ministry. And I'd ask her to briefly introduce her officials, and then we'll turn it over to the auditor to present, and then come back to you for response, and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you. Yes, as mentioned, I'm Jennifer Johnson. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for Parks with the Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport, standing in for Twyla McDougall. And I have Byron Davis with me, Executive Director of Park Planning and Facility Management, and Pam Herbert, Executive Director of Strategic and Corporate Services.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I'll turn it over to the provincial auditor and her office to present on the chapter. We'll go from there.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, Deputy Chair, committee members, and other officials. With me today is Mr. Jason Shaw, the Deputy Provincial Auditor, who will present on the chapter before us. The one chapter on the agenda does include 7 new recommendations for the committee's consideration, and I do want to thank the ministry officials for the cooperation that was extended to us during the course of our work. With that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
Thank you. The number of people visiting provincial parks is increasing. Visitors increased by 20% from 2019 to 2018. Park visitors rely on the ministry to provide a safe supply of drinking water. Unsafe drinking water can endanger public health, causing illness or, in extreme cases, death. At July 2019, the Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport provided drinking water in 25 provincial parks using 62 drinking water systems varying significantly in size and complexity. Depending on the volume of drinking water used, either the Water Security Agency or the Ministry of Health regulate the ministry's drinking water systems. We found these regulators had different requirements for the operation and maintenance of water systems, with the Ministry of Health imposing limited requirements. Also, since 2016, the ministry acts as its own regulator for 2 drinking water systems. In Chapter 23, in our 2019 report, Volume 2, starting on page 177, we concluded for the 15-month period ending July 31st, 2019, the Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport had effective processes to provide safe drinking water in provincial parks other than the 7 new recommendations made. On page 184, we recommended the ministry document key operational decisions and processes for its drinking water systems regulated by the Ministry of Health or itself. For its 38 health-regulated drinking water systems, the ministry had not established minimum expected operating requirements. Where Ministry of Health requirements did not include similar requirements to the Water Security Agency, we determined it important for the ministry to set minimum operating requirements. For example, health-regulated parks did not require daily chlorine testing, and we found for 4 of the 11 systems we tested, daily chlorine testing was not done. We found not having written guidance resulted in inconsistent operations of health-regulated water systems. For its 2 self-regulated drinking water systems, the ministry had not formalized how it planned to continue to operate and self-regulate these 2 systems. Not formalizing key decisions or processes in writing increases the risk of staff not operating systems consistent with good practice. On page 185, we recommended the ministry assign clear responsibility for preparing and maintaining written procedures necessary to operate its drinking water systems. We found the ministry did not make sure staff maintained in writing key procedures necessary to provide safe drinking water. For its seasonal drinking water systems that only operate during the summer, the ministry did not have documented water system startup and shutdown procedures. We found this was the case for 3 of the 9 parks we visited. Also, for its Water Security Agency regulated drinking water systems, the ministry did not make sure it maintained written quality control procedures as the Water Security Agency's permits require. We found this for 2 of 6 drinking water systems tested. Not having written procedures for key processes increases the risk of the ministry not operating drinking water systems consistent with good practice. On page 188, we made 2 recommendations. We recommended the ministry document routine maintenance expectations for its drinking water systems. Also, we recommended the ministry complete routine maintenance on its drinking water systems consistent with documented routine maintenance expectations. We found the ministry did not have routine maintenance expectations for its drinking water systems. Instead, it depended primarily on its certified operator's knowledge and experience to determine maintenance requirements. Each water system is different and has unique maintenance requirements. With over 60 water systems, it is important to document required maintenance activities to ensure and be able to monitor they are completed as expected. We found only one of 19 drinking water systems tested had documented maintenance procedures. Also, for 5 of the 19 systems we tested, we found no written record of any maintenance performed. Because the ministry did not have documented routine maintenance procedures, we could not determine whether staff completed all maintenance as expected. Not having documented routine maintenance expectations increases the risk of staff not understanding or knowing that routine maintenance is required. This risk increases when staff turnover occurs. In addition, routine maintenance keeps drinking water systems working effectively and helps avoid costly repairs or replacements. If drinking water system infrastructure fails, the ministry cannot provide safe drinking water to its park visitors. On page 189, we recommended the ministry routinely review key drinking water system operational records, including daily activity tracking sheets and operator logbooks. We found the ministry did not consistently review important operational records and did not consistently keep operational records for some of its health regulated water systems. For example, in our testing of water systems, we found the ministry did not consistently keep evidence of a supervisory review of key operational records, such as daily activity tracking sheets and operator logbooks for WSA regulated systems. This supervisory review was required by WSA in the permits it provides to operate these systems. The ministry also did not consistently keep evidence of similar supervisory review of these records for health regulated water systems. Not regularly supervising the completion of key activities increases the risk that ministry staff do not complete key operational procedures as required. For example, not testing chlorine levels daily increases the risk that drinking water is not safe. On page 190, we recommended the ministry document evidence of its review of water quality test results. We found the ministry completed water quality test regulatory requirements. For example, certain water systems tested water twice per month for the presence of harmful bacteria, as required. However, the ministry staff did not document evidence of reviewing these drinking water lab test results. As a result, the ministry could not show it promptly reviewed lab test results. Documenting its timely review of drinking water quality test results enables the ministry to demonstrate it actively identifies when drinking water is unsafe should it occur. On page 191, we recommended the ministry update its agreements with municipalities supplying drinking water to provincial parks to set needed water quantity and require municipalities to promptly advise the ministry of breaches in provincial drinking water standards. The ministry obtained drinking water from a nearby municipal drinking water system for 5 of its provincial parks. We assessed 4 of the ministry's agreements with these municipalities. We found none of the agreements specified that the municipality must promptly inform the ministry if water quality standards are not met. Also, one of the 4 agreements did not include the quantity of drinking water the ministry required from the municipality. By not requiring municipalities promptly inform the ministry of identified drinking water quality concerns, the ministry exposes itself to additional risk of receiving water that does not meet provincial drinking water standards and distributing that water to park visitors. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, the focus of the work. Thanks for the status update as well from the ministry, and I'll table that one now. PAC 7629, Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport, status update dated October 19th, 2022. I'll turn it over to the ADM to provide a brief response, and we'll open it up for questions.
Good morning. So as mentioned today, we are here to discuss the recommendations from the Provincial Auditor's 2019 report, Volume 2, Chapter 23, on the provision of safe drinking water in provincial parks. The supply of safe potable water is one of the most important services our ministry provides to park visitors, and we take this responsibility very seriously. In 2019, the Provincial Auditor's report found the ministry had effective processes in place to provide safe drinking water in provincial parks. These included a clear understanding of regulatory requirements, the use of certified system operators, appropriate permitting of water systems, and proper water sampling and testing protocols. The report made 7 recommendations for process improvement, and I am pleased to report significant progress in the following areas. The report recommended, as mentioned, the documentation of key operational decisions and processes for drinking water systems in parks. The ministry has since developed a policy to clarify expectations and requirements for the operation of water system in parks. Resources have been developed to complement the new policy, including tools, templates, and written procedures to assist park staff with implementation. The provincial auditor recommended the ministry assign clear responsibility for preparing and maintaining written procedures for water system operation. The ministry's new drinking water policy clearly defines responsibility for preparing and maintaining written procedures. The 3rd and 4th recommendations in the report referenced a need to document and carry out routine maintenance expectations for drinking water systems in parks. In response, routine maintenance expectations for water systems have now been outlined in the ministry's drinking water policy, including the development of a checklist for maintenance tasks to be completed at required intervals. Tailoring those checklists to individual water systems is a future objective for the ministry and will be implemented with the help of our recently staffed utilities technologist position. The 5th and 6th recommendations in the provincial auditor's report identified the need for routine review of key operational records, including checklist and water quality tests, along with documenting evidence of the reviews. The ministry has adopted the Water Security Agency's monthly review of operational records policy for self-regulated and the Ministry of Health regulated water systems. Under this requirement, the park manager or designate is responsible for monthly review of water operation checklists and water test results, along with documentation in the form of a digital record. A user guide has been developed and training sessions have been held to support implementation of this new requirement. The final recommendation from the provincial auditor advised the ministry to update its agreements with municipalities supplying drinking water to provincial parks in order to require utilities to promptly advise the ministry of breaches in water standards. The ministry has 4 such agreements with municipalities and regional water utilities where water is directly supplied to provincial parks. The agreements have been updated as recommended. The provincial auditor has recently completed a follow-up audit to review progress on the recommendations and test processes adopted by the ministry since the 2019 report. My staff have provided the auditors access to all relevant information for that purpose. On behalf of the Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport, I would like to acknowledge the work of the provincial auditor of Saskatchewan and extend our appreciation for your recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Johnson, and to everyone involved in this work. I'll open it up now to the committee for questions. Ms. Young.
You go first. Thank you so much, and thank you for the good work and the progress that has been made on these recommendations so far. I guess a high-level question. Due to some of the gaps in terms of like the maintenance and the procedures and reporting responsibilities identified, have there ever been, has either damage to water systems ever occurred as a result or significant public health concerns?
They're managing it, yeah.
Hi, Byron Davis, Executive Director of Park Planning and Facilities Management. We fortunately have not had significant serious issues with water quality in the parks. We have routine startup and shutdown procedures where we introduce precautionary drinking water advisories on a temporary basis, but we've had no serious impacts.
Great news. In regards to the timeline between the introduction of some of these recommendations and, the point in time that we find ourselves in now, in 2022, I believe this was initially 2019 that these reports were made. Can you speak to the work that was undertaken and the work that is still outstanding and how that was prioritized?
Sure, well, I'll start and Byron can add to it if needed, but at first we had to develop a policy and come up with a list of items that we did need to formalize and do a better job of documenting as per the recommendations. And so the policy implementation was first. We pulled together a working group to ensure we were addressing all of the auditor's recommendations. And then one by one, we started to implement. We also started with higher level overarching procedures in place, and now we are tailoring to each individual water system. There's very granular differences between the variety of systems, and so we started with a high-level overview, and now we're getting more granular as we go. Is there anything else you'd want to add to that?
I would just say that in addition to the policy, we've developed a user guide, checklists, trying to make things user-friendly for the water system operators and yet comply with all of the requirements.
Thank you. And the utilities technologist position, when was that created?
It was just staffed this spring. We've been looking to have a more centralized resource to help with the implementation of the policy, as well as helping to deal with any emergent water system issues across the system.
Perfect. And is that a position that's anticipated to be not like a technical HR sense of term position just to address these kind of pressing recommendations, but this will be an ongoing role for somebody with Parks and Culture and Rec?
I suspect it will be. We also have a water system specialist already in the ministry, and so this position is to assist with that and assist with the implementation of these recommendations.
Perfect. Thank you. Specific question, how's the water at Good Spirit?
It's great. We were just talking about that before walking in here, actually. Yeah, no more precautionary water advisories there, and Byron tells me the water there is excellent.
Here, it's a lovely campsite, a lovely area, part of the province.
Just a quick question. By groundwater, do you mean out of the lake?
Groundwater would be underground water, and then surface water would be lake level water.
So underground, so like a well?
Oh, well, yes.
Okay, that's groundwater? Okay. There you go.
No other questions at this point?
Prescriptive, but I thought it was a great little idea on the campsite reservation system being used to notify visitors of any water advisories that may be in place, either due to startup or an emergent situation. As an avid camper in the province, but somebody who often forgets water as the one thing, I'm curious if there are some common sense solutions being explored to help. I think the record numbers of people who are enjoying the provincial parks ensure that they're going in kitted out for success.
Do already use the campground reservation system.
Great.
Yeah, you get it's a little red alert.
Wonderful. Pardon me, I misread that as a suggestion not in place. Excellent. Thanks. No further questions, Mr. Chair.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks to the officials that are here today for their time with us and all their work on this front. Certainly, our provincial parks are something we're all so proud of and all enjoy. And safe water is critical. So thanks for your work and the work that'll be undertaken in the months ahead. We'll do follow-up as a committee. Of course, the auditor leads that. Not seeing any other questions, I'd welcome a motion to concur and note compliance with recommendations 1, 5, and 7. Moved by Mr. Harrison, all agreed. That's carried. And with respect to recommendations 2, 3, 4, and 6, I'd welcome a motion to concur and note progress. Moved by Mr. Gowdy, all agreed. That's carried. Okay, well, thank you so much. Ms. Johnson, any final parting remarks our way before we break for lunch? We'd like to thank you and your officials for being here today.
No, thanks for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. We'll recess for lunch.